There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
When President Kennedy said those words, it seemed inevitable that the entire history of human expansion, both physical and technological, would culminate with a living, breathing man stepping out onto the surface of the moon. Science fiction had been dreaming of it for the better part of a century, and given how rapidly man's powers had progressed in that time, it no longer seemed like a fantasy. The entire nation, no, the entire world, was thus prepared for the journey, and there wasn't a soul alive who didn't look up and think about what might be there on our celestial satellite, waiting for us. While scientists and engineers worked out the monumental task of getting there in real life, writers and filmmakers explored the possibilities, and one way to do that was to look back at the works of the philosophical pioneers who had already tread where mankind had yet to arrive, mental giants like H.G. Wells.
An international team of astronauts has finally landed on the moon. Prepared to plant Earth's flag as the first men to ever reach the lunar surface, they discover to their shock that theirs is not the only flag. This begins the unraveling of a secret long forgotten of 3 people who managed to precede them by over 60 years, and when they track down the sole survivor of this Victorian-era trip to the moon, they learn a harrowing story of fantastic material science, of an advanced alien civilization, and of a narrow escape from permanent captivity. With the threat of unseen dangers lurking beneath their feet, should the astronauts have dared to travel to our sister world?
It took only 16 minutes to change the world. Ask anyone what the most influential and important science fiction film of all time is, and you'll likely hear talk of Star Wars, 2001, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and more. But in reality, there can only be one answer, and it is George Méliès's A Trip to the Moon, a roughly 16-minute short film made at the dawn of the 20th century that demonstrated the endless possibilities of film as an artistic medium. While certainly not the first film or even the first famous film, A Trip to the Moon is nevertheless the movie we think of most when we think of the birth of cinema, with that iconic shot of the space capsule on the face of the moon, a permanent symbol of how it all started. While Jules Verne tends to get the lion's share of the credit for the story, which is loosely based on Verne's novels From the Earth to the Moon and Around the Moon, the second half of the movie has far more in common with another novel, one that had just recently been published in France when Méliès set out to make his science fiction film, and one that had been made by that other great granddaddy of science fiction, H.G. Wells. It is from this other novel, The First Men in the Moon, that A Trip to the Moon gets its more fantastic elements, especially the insectoid selenite beings and their mighty ruler that live beneath the surface of the moon. The First Men in the Moon would become the basis of its own full-length film adaptation in 1919, often erroneously cited as the first full-length science fiction film adapted from a novel. For the record, that honor probably belongs to another Jules Verne adaptation, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, in 1916. 1919's The First Men in the Moon, though, wasn't much of a success, deviating heavily from the source material and featuring notably terrible special effects and costumes, even for the time period. It is now a lost film, and though I can find no contemporary sources that cite Wells's reaction to the film, given what he thought of all subsequent adaptations that emerged in his lifetime, aside from the one he was personally involved with, it's safe to say he probably didn't approve of it. However, after the writer's death but before Neil Armstrong finally took that one small step, the novel was given another go, this time with the help of the special effects legend Ray Harryhausen. The topic of today's video was voted on by my patrons. If you'd like to have a say in some of the movies I cover, want to see bonus content, or just wish to support the growth of this channel, check out my Patreon or consider becoming a channel member. I'd like to give a special shout out to my $8 androids, Batty Bat Firebrand, Chuck Poor, Diane McGill Davis, Giffen Chumley, Jack Blair, John Burrell, Mike O'Connor, Numinous 2019, Patrick Baker, Robert McGill, Sean Vale, Spoats, TB Shrumick, and Warren Davis. I sincerely couldn't do this without you guys, so thank you all. In the late 1950s, following the successes of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, It Came from Beneath the Sea, and The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, Ray Harryhausen convinced his production partner Charles H. Schneer to purchase the rights to H.G. Wells's The First Men in the Moon from H.G.'s son, Frank Wells. Schneer's heart wasn't totally in it though, and a few years later, while working on Jason and the Argonauts, Harryhausen was under the impression that his next film would be based on a different H.G. Wells story, The Food of the Gods. Then Harryhausen met with Nigel Kneale, the writer behind The Quatermass Experiment, who was also a fan of The First Men in the Moon and had the idea to frame the story around the timely plot device of a modern moon landing. With Kneale's help as screenwriter, Harryhausen was finally able to convince Schneer to produce First Men in the Moon, and thus, once Jason and the Argonauts was completed, First Men in the Moon became their next project. To direct, they hired Nathan Joran, who had also directed the previous Schneer and Harryhausen pictures 20 Million Miles to Earth and The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, as well as directing previous review topic, The Deadly Mantis. When it came to casting, the script only had 3 main characters, the 2 male leads from the original book, Bedford and Caver, along with an added love interest, possibly a holdover from the 1919 version. To play the gruff and acerbic Bedford, they cast Edward Judd. Given Judd's notorious reputation for being arrogant, mean-spirited, and difficult to work with, it's pretty spot-on casting. Columbia Pictures, which had signed him to a 3-picture deal following his performance in Val Guest's The Day the Earth Caught Fire, had high hopes for the actor to become a leading man, but his on-screen behavior relegated him to mostly television roles and soap operas. The scientist Caver is played by Lionel Jeffries, a comedic character actor who had previously appeared in The Quatermass Experiment, The Revenge of Frankenstein, and The Trials of Oscar Wilde. He tended to play characters much older than himself, and Caver is no exception, as Jeffries was only in his mid-30s at the time of filming. Both Jeffries and Judd had difficulty with the heavy reliance on visual effects, because in those days, it was much more unusual to act on a half-blank set covered by matte screens, and they didn't get along well with director Nathan Joran, who was more of a technical director than an actor's director. As for the aforementioned female lead, Kate Callender, she is played by Oscar-nominated American actress Martha Heyer, who had supporting roles in Sabrina and Some Came Running, among much else. Other notable actors include Miles Mallison as the registrar, Gladys Henson as the nursing home matron, and a walk-on cameo by Peter Finch, who happened to be working on another film nearby when the actor originally slated to play the bailiff, William Rushton, failed to appear. After months of pre-production that included Schneer and Harryhausen each visiting NASA to consult on the project, filming on First Men in the Moon began in October of 1963. Though location scouting had taken place in Spain, the entire movie was filmed at Shepperton Studios outside of London. Schneer decided that the film should be shot in widescreen Panavision, which made things both difficult and prohibitively expensive for Harryhausen and his trademark Dynamation process. Though nearly a year of post-production was given to Harryhausen to do the effects, he would ultimately have to whittle down his ambitions for the project to just 3 primary sequences, none of which he was ultimately happy with, and he would voice grave dissatisfaction with having to use children in suits for some of the Selenite creatures. As a result, it was the only time he ever worked in Panavision, and though he does talk fondly of it, he considers First Men in the Moon one of his lesser works. First Men in the Moon released wide over Thanksgiving weekend in 1964, to mixed reviews that felt it leaned too hard on comedy, dismissing it as more of a children's picture than a serious film. And though it was reasonably successful in Great Britain, it didn't take off in North America, where it only grossed $1.6 million in rentals, $500,000 less than the filmmakers' previous effort, Jason and the Argonauts, and only half of the gross of 1958's The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. Though it remains well known, especially to lovers of Harryhausen and 60s adventure movies, it isn't as fondly remembered as those other efforts. And I can see why. Don't get me wrong, I do enjoy First Men in the Moon, and consider it a great movie to watch alongside the likes of Mysterious Island and Journey to the Center of the Earth. However, I've always thought the story was one of H.G. Wells's clunkier ones, and the movie doesn't really improve upon it. While I personally don't mind the added humor, which tends to get most of the blame for the movie's underperformance, I don't think the romantic angle adds much or makes the main character Bedford any more likable or interesting. If anything, it makes him even worse because of how horrible he is to Mary. I also feel like one of the book's strengths, its fantastic imagery of, for example, wild plants growing rapidly in the light of the lunar morning, is lost. Yes, it would be an anachronism, and yes, the budget was already stretched beyond reason, but a few crystals and a single moon cow don't make up for the many amazing and interesting things Wells describes in the novel. Perhaps it should have embraced the scientific inaccuracies of the story, because, after all, it's not like they're any more egregious than the idea of a kingdom of aliens living beneath the regolith. Besides, given how the story ends, would it really have been that difficult to say that plants and a rudimentary atmosphere used to exist on the surface, but that, like the Selenites, they had since gone extinct? But since we're talking about the ending, let's talk about British colonialism, one of the primary allegories of both Wells's book and this adaptation. It's no secret Wells took issue with colonialism, it's what The War of the Worlds is all about, and Bedford is a none too subtle stand-in for the colonial spirit, of the reckless brutality of conquering new lands and treating the natives with unearned superiority and unprovoked violence. In the book, Bedford is even responsible for the horrifying death of a child upon his return to Earth, which he is surprisingly blasé about. However, the movie does change things up a bit in that the Selenites, rather than just cutting off Caver's line of communication and going dark, are rendered extinct by the germs Caver and Bedford brought with them. This is an even greater indictment of colonialism that stays true to Wells, even borrowing the fatal plot device from The War of the Worlds, but the trade-off is that it tries to soften Bedford, to not quite redeem him, but to make sure the romantic subplot could come to its logical conclusion and set the stage for the bookending story where Bedford tells the tale from his nursing home. And as for that bookending story where astronauts land on the moon believing themselves to be the first ones only to discover they're not, it may have been the linchpin that made the story more palatable for Schneer, but it also works against the anti-colonialist message of the story. If it is meant to capitalize on the race to the moon that defined the 1960s, it feels more like an indictment than it is a celebration. Sure, the accidental genocide of an alien species is treated like little more than the punchline to a tonally awkward joke to close out the movie.
He did have such a terrible cold.
But it makes for an uncomfortable message relating to mankind's desire to explore, the very thing JFK was waxing poetic about in his speech. I'm not opposed to a provocative subtext, even in a movie that presents itself as a family-friendly fantasy adventure, but here, it feels unintentional, as though they wanted to keep the story's anti-colonial message but also wanted to excite audiences about traveling to the moon, a contradiction they couldn't quite fix, assuming they even noticed it. Then again, maybe I'm just reading too much into it. it wouldn't be the first time. As I said, I do enjoy the movie and I do love Harryhausen's effects, specifically the Selenites, but I guess I nitpick because I think it could be better. As adaptations of H.G. Wells' stories go, it's definitely not the worst, and I respect it for trying to be as true to the story as it can, while also updating it for the sensibilities of its time. I may take issue with some of its choices, but First Men in the Moon is absolutely a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Which H.G. Wells adaptation doesn't get enough love? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time when we'll be attacked by mutant alien guards, this is the Unapologetic Geek telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a solemn moment. Liberty is at hand. Goodbye, Gwendolen. Bye, Victoria. Bye. Thank you. I shall always be grateful for everything you've done.